Section 1. Of Little Journeys to the Homes of English Authors. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett Wood. Little Journeys to the Homes of English Authors by Elbert Hubbard. Section 1. William Morris, Part 1. The Idle Singer. Of heaven or hell I have no power to sing. I cannot ease the burden of your fears, or make quick coming death a little thing, or bring again the pleasure of past years. Nor for my words shall ye forget your tears, or hope again for aught that I can say, the idle singer of an empty day. But rather, when aweary of your mirth, from full hearts still unsatisfied ye sigh, and feeling kindly unto all the earth, grudge every minute as it passes by, made the more mindful than the sweet days die. Remember me a little then, I pray, the idle singer of an empty day. Dreamer of dreams, born out of my due time, why should I strive to set the crooked straight? Let it suffice me that my murmuring rhyme beats with light wing against the ivory gate, telling a tale not too importunate to those who in the sleepy region stay, lulled by the singer of an empty day. From The Earthly Paradise, William Morris. The parents of William Morris were well-to-do people who lived in the village of Walthamstow, Essex. The father was a London bill-broker, cool-headed, calculating, practical. In the home of his parents, William Morris received small impulse in the direction of art. He, however, was taught how to make both ends meet, and there were drilled into his character many good lessons of plain common sense, a rather unusual equipment for a poet, but still one that should not be waived or considered lightly. At the village school, William was neither precocious nor dull, neither black nor white, his cosmos being simply a sort of slaty grey, a condition of being which attracted no special attention from either his schoolfellows or his tutors. From the village school he went to Marlborough Academy, where, by patient grubbing, he fitted himself for Exeter College, Oxford. Morris the elder proved his good sense by taking no very special interest in the boy's education. Violence of direction in education falls flat. Man is a lonely creature and has to work out his career in his own way. To help the grub spin its cocoon is quite unnecessary, and to play the part of Mrs. Gamp with the butterfly in its chrysalis stage is to place a quietus upon its career. The whole science of modern education is calculated to turn out a good, fairish, commonplace article, but the formula for a genius remains a secret with deity. The great man becomes great in spite of teachers and parents, and his near kinsmen, being colour-blind, usually pooh-pooh the idea that he is anything more than mediocre. At Oxford, William Morris fell in with a young man of about his own age by the name of Edward Burne-Jones. Burne-Jones was studying theology. He was slender in stature, dreamy, spiritual, poetic. Morris was a giant in strength, blunt in speech, bold in manner, and had a shock of hair like a lion's mane. This was in the year 1853. These young men being 19 years of age. The slender, yellow, dreamy student of theology and the ruddy athlete became fast friends. "Send your sons to college and the boys will educate them," said Emerson. These boys read poetry together, and it seems the first author that specially attracted them was Mrs. Browning, and she attracted them simply because she had recently eloped with the man she loved. This fact proved to Morris that she was a worthy woman and a discerning. She had the courage of her convictions. To elope with a poor poet, leaving a rich father and a luxurious home, what nobler ambition? Burne-Jones, student of theology, considered her action proof of depravity. Morris, in order to show his friend that Mrs. Browning was really a rare and gentle soul, read aloud to Burne-Jones from her books. Morris himself had never read much of Mrs. Browning's work, but in championing her cause and interesting his friend in her, he grew interested himself. Like lawyers, we undertake a cause first and look for proof later. In teaching another, Morris taught himself. By explaining a theme, it becomes luminous to us. In passing, it is well to note that this impulse in the heart of William Morris to come to the defence of an accused person was ever very strong. His defence of Mrs. Browning led straight to The Defence of Guinevere, begun while at Oxford and printed in book form in his 24th year. Not that the offences of Guinevere and Elizabeth Barrett were parallel, but Morris was by nature a defender of women. And it should further be noted that Tennyson had not yet written his Idylls of the King at the time Morris wrote his poetic brief. Another author that these young men took up at this time was Ruskin. John Ruskin was 15 years older than Morris, an Oxford man too, also the son of a merchant and rich by inheritance. Ruskin's natural independence, his ability for original thinking, and his action in embracing the cause of Turner, the ridiculed, won the heart of Morris. In Ruskin he found a writer who expressed the thoughts that he believed. He read Ruskin and insisted that Burne-Jones should. Together they read The Nature of Gothic, and then they went out upon the streets of Oxford and studied examples at first hand. They compared the old with the new, and came to the conclusion that the buildings erected 2 centuries before had various points to recommend them which modern buildings have not. The modern buildings were built by contractors, while the old ones were constructed by men who had all the time there was, and so they worked out their conceptions of the eternal fitness of things. Then these young men, with several others, drew up a remonstrance against the desecration by officious restoration and the tearing down of time-mellowed structures to make room for the unsightly brick piles of boarding-house keepers. The remonstrance was sent in to the authorities, and by them duly pigeonholed, with a passing remark that young fellows sent to Oxford to be educated had better attend to their books and mind their own business. Having espoused the cause of the Middle Ages in architecture, these young men began to study the history of the people who lived in the olden time. They read Spenser and Chaucer, and chance threw in their way a dog-eared copy of Malory's Morte d'Arthur, and this was still more dog-eared when they were through with it. Probably no book ever made more of an impression on Morris than this one, and if he had written an article for the Ladies' Home Journal on books that influenced me most, he would have placed Malory's Morte d'Arthur first. The influence of Burne-Jones on Morris was marked, and the influence of Morris on Burne-Jones was profound. Morris discovered himself in explaining things to Burne-Jones, and Burne-Jones, without knowing it, adopted the opinions of Morris, and it was owing to Morris that he gave up theology. Having abandoned the object that led him to college, Burne-Jones lost faith in Oxford and went down to London to study art. Morris hung on, secured his B.A., and articled himself to a local architect with the firm intent of stopping the insane drift for modern mediocrity and bringing about a just regard for the stately dignity of the Gothic. A few months' experience, however, and he discovered that an apprentice to an architect was not expected to furnish plans or even criticize those already made. His business was to make detailed drawings from completed designs for the contractors to work from. A year at architecture, with odd hours filled in at poetry and art, and news came from Burne-Jones that he had painted a picture and sold it for £10. Now Morris had all the money he needed. His father's prosperity was at flood, and he had but to hint for funds, and they came. Yet to make things with your own hands and sell them was the true test of success. He had written Goethe's Lovers, The Tale of the Hollow Land, and various poems and essays for the college magazine, and his book, The Defence of Guinevere, had been issued at his own expense, and the edition was on his hands, a weary wait. Thoreau wrote to his friends when the house burned and destroyed all copies of his first book, "The edition is exhausted." But no such happiness came to Morris, and so when glad tidings of an artistic success came from Burne-Jones, he resolved to follow the lead and abandon architecture for pure art. Arriving in London, he placed himself under the tutorship of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, poet, dreamer, and artist, 6 years his senior, whom he had known for some time, and who had also instructed Burne-Jones. While taking lessons in painting at the rather shabby house of Rossetti in Portland Street, he was introduced to Rossetti's favourite model, a young woman of rare grace and beauty. Rossetti had painted her picture as the Blessed Damozel, leaning over the bar of heaven, while the stars in her hair were 7. Morris, the impressionable, fell in love with the canvas, and then with the woman. When they were married, tradition has it that Rossetti withheld his blessing and sought to drown his sorrow in fomentations, with dark, dank hints in baritone, to the effect that the Thames only could appreciate his grief. But grief is transient, and for many years Dante Rossetti and Burne-Jones pictured the tall, willowy figure of Mrs. Morris as the dream woman, on tapestry and canvas, and as the Blessed Virgin, her beautiful face and form are shown in many sacred places. Truth need not be distorted in a frantic attempt to make this an ideal marriage. Only a woman with the intellect of Minerva could have filled the restless heart of William Morris. But the wife of Morris believed in her lord and never sought to hamper him, and if she failed at times to comprehend his genius, it was only because she was human. Whistler once remarked that without Mrs. Morris to supply stained-glass attitudes and the lissom beauty of an angel, the pre-Raphaelites would have long since gone down to dust and forgetfulness. The year which William Morris spent at architecture he considered as nearly a waste of time, but it was not so in fact. As a draftsman he had developed a marvellous skill, and the grace and sureness of his lines were a delight to Burne-Jones, Rossetti, Holman Hunt, Ford Madox Brown, and others of the little artistic circle in which he found himself. Youth lays great plans. Youth is always in revolt against the present order. Youth groups itself in bands and swears eternal fealty, and life, which is change, dissipates the plans, subdues the revolt into conformity, and the sworn friendships fade away into dull indifference. Always? Well, no, not exactly. In this instance, the plans and dreams found form. The revolt was a revolution that succeeded, and the brotherhood existed for near 50 years, and then was severed only by death. Without going into a history of the pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, it will be noted that the band of enthusiasts in art, literature, and architecture had been swung by the arguments and personality of William Morris into the strong current of his own belief, and this was that art and life in the Middle Ages were much lovelier things than they are now. That being so, we should go back to medieval times for our patterns. A study of the best household decorations of the 15th century showed that all the furniture used then was made to fit a certain apartment and with a definite purpose in view. Of course it was made by hand, and the loving marks of the tool were upon it. It was made as good and strong and durable as it could be made. Floors and walls were of mosaic or polished wood, and these were partly covered by beautifully woven rugs, skins, and tapestries. The ceilings were sometimes ornamented with pictures painted in harmony with the use for which the room was designed. Certainly there were no chromos, and the pictures were few, and these of the best, for the age was essentially a critical one. A modest circular was issued in which the fact was made known that a company of historical artists will use their talents in home decoration. Dealers into whose hands this circular fell smiled in derision, and the announcement made no splash in England's artistic waters. But the leaven was at work which was bound to cause a revolution in the tastes of 50 million people. Most of our best moves are accidents, and every good thing begins as something else. In the beginning, there was no expectation of building up a trade or making a financial success of the business. The idea was simply that the 8 young men who composed the band were to use their influence in helping one another to secure commissions and corroborate the views of doubting patrons as to what was art and what not. In other words, they were to stand by one another. Ford Madox Brown, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Burne-Jones, and Arthur Hughes were painters, Philip Webb an architect, Peter Paul Marshall a landscape gardener and engineer, Charles Joseph Faulkner, an Oxford don, was a designer, and William Morris was an all-round artist, ready to turn his hand to anything. These men undertook to furnish a home from garret to cellar in an artistic way. Work came, and each set himself to help all the others. From simply supplying designs for furniture, rugs, carpets, and wallpaper, they began to manufacture these things, simply because they could not buy or get others to make the things they desired. Morris undertook the entire executive charge of affairs and mastered the details of half a dozen trades in order that he might intelligently conduct the business. The one motto of the firm was, "Not how cheap, but how good." They insisted that housekeeping must be simplified, and that we should have fewer things and have them better. To this end, single pieces of furniture were made, and all sets of furniture discarded. I have seen several houses furnished entirely by William Morris, and the first thing that impressed me was the sparsity of things. Instead of a dozen pictures in a room, there were 2 or 3, one on an easel and 1 or 2 on the walls. Gilt frames were abandoned almost entirely, and dark-stained woods were used instead. Wide fireplaces were introduced, and mantels of solid oak. For upholstery, leather covering was commonly used instead of cloth. Carpets were laid in strips, not tacked down to stay, and rugs were laid so as to show a goodly glimpse of hardwood floor, and in the dining room a large round table was placed instead of a right-angled square one. This table was not covered with a tablecloth. Instead, mats and doilies were used here and there. To cover a table entirely with a cloth or spread was pretty good proof that the piece of furniture was cheap and shabby. So in no William Morris library or dining room would you find a table entirely covered. The round dining table is in very general use now, but few people realize how its plainness was scouted when William Morris first introduced it. One piece of William Morris furniture has become decidedly popular in America, and that is the Morris chair. The first chair of this pattern was made entirely by the hands of the master. It was built by a man who understood anatomy, unlike most chairs and all church pews. It was also strong, durable, ornamental, and by a simple device the back could be adjusted so as to fit a man's every mood. There has been a sad degeneracy among William Morris chairs. Still, good ones can be obtained, nearly as excellent as the one in which I rested at Kelmscott House, broad, deep, massive, upholstered with curled hair and covered with leather that would delight a bookbinder. Such a chair can be used a generation and then passed on to the heirs. Furnishing of churches and chapels led naturally to the making of stained glass windows, and hardly a large city of Christendom but has an example of the Morris work. Morris managed to hold that erratic genius, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, in line and direct his efforts, which of itself was a feat worthy of record. He made a fortune for Rossetti, who was a child in this world's affairs, and he also made a fortune for himself and every man connected with the concern. Burne-Jones stood by the ship manfully and proved his good sense by never interfering with the master's plans or asking foolish, quibbling questions, showing faith on all occasions. End of section 1.